Before we sing our final carol, I've asked Jim if he would like to share some thoughts with us. Take that one.
Great. I'm going to just speak for a few moments on finding peace in anxious times. Finding peace in anxious times. I wonder for all of us here, what are the things that you see or the things that we hear that as we approach Christmas that it just brings joy to your heart? For me, there's a few things. One is, in some ways, when the night starts drawing in this time of year, it gets kind of chilly and cold. It gets very atmospheric, doesn't it? I also love hearing the Christmas carols. The ones we've been singing tonight. We were at a Christmas service in Cardiff last weekend, and hearing "O Come All You Faithful," the first one we sang it, it just did something special in my heart. I also love the Salvation Army Brass Band. When I phoned the St. David's Centre, there's about 4 times I'm going to be down there, so I'm going to pop down and just soak up the atmosphere. I just love the songs, I love the instruments, and just everything about it. And that's, in some ways, I would describe that as a sense of peace that it brings to my heart. And that's something that is at the core of the Christmas story, isn't it? One of the verses that we read just toward the end that Kaz read, in the NIV version, it says in verse 14, when the heavenly host appeared, it said, "Glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth peace on whom his favour rests." So God came to give us peace through Jesus. And so let's think about that peace, what it is and what it isn't. First of all, what isn't it? Well, it's not about the cessation of war, is it? I was reading on the internet the Council of Foreign Affairs, and apparently there's 27 wars going on at the moment in the world. We've heard about some of them, about the war in Ukraine, of course, and in Ethiopia, and there's 25 other ones that know about in Yemen, Myanmar, and other places. And so for a lot of places in the world, life can be quite difficult, and it's a struggle for people. And yet at the same time, we have a lot to be thankful for here. In fact, many countries in Europe, since Second World War, we've experienced relative peace, haven't we? And that's something to thank God for, as well as the freedoms that we enjoy. But for a lot of people, it reminds me of the watering hole that you see in movies like The Lion King, and you have like the wildebeest or the deer will need to go to the water to get a drink, and yet every time they go, they'll face a danger of being attacked by a crocodile or a lion or a cheetah. And it's like that for millions of Christians around the world. Every time they want to go to church, they face maybe experiencing abuse, maybe being bullied, or maybe even worse. And that's something that they have to deal with. And so whatever God's peace was, it's not fully manifested on this earth in that sense. It will be one day in heaven, but at the moment, for many people, they're experiencing difficulty. So another thing, we'll go and explore peace with God and peace in our hearts and minds. But another aspect of what it is and what it isn't, it's not so much that God, in giving us peace, will take us out of problems, but that He'll be with us in the struggles, and He'll also deliver us from the struggles. If we think about God delivering us from the struggles, there's many interventions. We see in the life of Paul, don't we, in Corinthians, how he was shipwrecked and he experienced all these different things, and yet he was an overcomer. And Jesus said, didn't he, in this world you will have troubles, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And in some ways that might seem, if you just want your problems to go away, that can seem like not very good comfort, is it? It could be something, well, I want to be in a different situation. But sometimes God's answer will be to be with us, and sometimes it takes time and it's a bit different than what we experience. And sometimes God will deliver us through supporters like yourself. I was thinking recently there's a lady in Vietnam called Hoa. She's a single mother, and she came to Christ in August this year, just a few weeks ago. And she had to leave her village because she was told that if she didn't give up her faith, something terrible would happen. So she either had to leave as a Christian or stay and give up her faith, abandon her faith. Now she was able to go somewhere where Open Doors were able to provide her with accommodation, and then we've been asked to pray that God would provide her with a means by which she can have livelihood and earn money. But what I love about God is that He's the creator of the universe, and yet He knows this woman by name. In the eyes of the world, this is an insignificant woman. She's very low in the social rank, and yet Jesus knows her by name. He knows each one of you by name. And you're all special to God. And God has delivered her through other Christians in Vietnam. I love the story of the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. You know that story? And there's a bit where, the poor kids, they go through the wardrobe and they explore Narnia. And they come across Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. And they hear about Aslan the lion, who, of course, is a symbol of Jesus. He's the king. And one of the kids, Susan, inquires about who is he. And Mr. Beaver says, Aslan is a lion, the great lion. Ooh, said Susan, I thought he was a man. Is he safe? Who said anything about being safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. And in that sense, God, once again, promises to be with us in trouble, and he delivers us from trouble. But it's not about being safe in that sense. At the same time, we're encouraged to go to God, aren't we? He's a refuge in time of need. We can go to him. We can believe that he will help us. And as we keep praying, we can believe that he's the deliverer. We're overcomers through him, aren't we? So there's these sort of truths and tension in the Bible, isn't it? On one hand, the focus is on Jesus being with us. The other hand, he's also our deliverer. But we need to bear that in mind. So let's just look for a few minutes about peace with God and also peace in our hearts and minds. So first of all, Jesus did come and bring us peace with God, didn't he? Through accepting Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior, believing that we've fallen short of God's standard, accepting in our life, we have peace with God. And perhaps many of us here have been Christians for a number of years, and we can take that for granted, what that feels like, to have that peace in our conscience. Remember years ago when I became a Christian myself, I was hitchhiking across Canada. I think I mentioned that last time I was here, and staying in a homeless hostel that was run by Christians, and they would preach at you before they give you food, and so you had to sort of listen to it unless you wanted to go hungry. But it was like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle fitting together, and it was only a matter of days when I was in this place in Canada, and I decided, yes, I want to become a Christian. I realized that I'd fallen short of God's standard. So one day I was picking plums, and I was halfway up the ladder, and I just looked up and I said, Jesus, I've made a mess of my life. I've sinned. I believe you're the Son of God. Please come in and take over my life. And what I can remember that day was just a sense of peace. And that peace has been with me ever since then, all those years. And but what does it mean? That's another area, peace in our hearts and minds. Now that's important, isn't it? Because there's so many things that can trouble us. Jesus said, don't let your hearts be troubled. In the Bible, we see times when people were fearful. All these sorts of emotions. Let's just look at a couple of things that can bring us stress and anxiety before we look at what we can do to counteract that. Mental health. So research published last month showed that almost half of British people are experiencing challenges to mental health once a week or more. And the biggest factors of these are the cost of living, relationship issues, or work pressures. At food banks, Wales has the highest rate of food bank use in the UK. And worked it out for places the size of Penyrheol. That would mean that in 1 year, there would be about 7,000 food parcels delivered. And I thank God for food banks, and there's no stigma attached. I've used them myself in Canada. But I also wish that we didn't need them. But you can imagine the anxiety for some people, maybe even in work where people need to access food in that way. The anxiety, the stress that might be associated with that sometimes. And just finally, another aspect of stress and anxiety, looking at social media. Now, this is a little bit of a generational thing. Notice the younger you get, the more you sort of go au fait with it, and you know all about it.
I'd say that you believe you are, the more tech smart you are.
Anyway, so social media. So for men, approximately 1 in 3 men experience negative feelings when scrolling through social media. But for women, it's just over half, 55% of women reported feelings when scrolling through social media. And the top 3 negative feelings are anxiety, feeling less attractive, and feeling less confident. So, just before we look at what God can do for our hearts and minds, just think that we're in a society where there's all these situations around us, all these, you could say, pressures or influences that can affect us. And so I just want to highlight a few areas where we can do some things that will help to bring God's peace in our hearts and minds. So, number one is stand firm. Now, there was a survey, report came out last week that said that in the last census, less than 50% of people put that they were Christian on that day in the census. Now, we're still in many ways, we enjoy the benefits of living in a country that had Christian heritage, but there's a lot of other influences around us, a lot of people with different points of view, and we can be in our work or school, and people could express views, and perhaps it might upset us a bit. It might sort of affect us, and we need to stand firm in our faith, and perhaps have brothers and sisters around who we can pray with, whatever it is, whatever knocks we get. My wife, shouldn't mind me saying it, but she went for an exam about 5 years ago. She's in the police now, and she's doing very well, but she went for an exam when she was developing as a lawyer, and she finished the exam, or so she thought. She finished early, like it was about something like a 2-hour exam, and she finished half an hour early. So, wow, that was easy. I aced it. And then she found out later, she hadn't turned the page over, and there was a whole third question. So she only got, whatever she got is only 2/3 of the total thing, and it really affected her for a while, and we sort of walked through that together. It wasn't just a case of praying about it once, but we talked about it, and we prayed about it. But she sort of wondered, why did God allow that to happen? It could have affected her a little bit, but thank God it didn't. And the second thing, so stand firm, second one is be reconciled to one another. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily having conversations. It can mean just saying kind words. And sometimes around Christmas we see friends and family that we don't see at other times of the year. And sometimes maybe there can be little niggles or things that have been said, or maybe you think that someone meant this or they meant that. And it can affect you a little bit. I like the thought, the phrase, I've only heard it in the past couple of years, but we talk about people living rent-free in your head. Now, I'm one of my brothers, I got 4 brothers, and they're all lovely, but one, sometimes he says things in a bit of a clumsy way, and if I'm not careful, I can think that he meant it this, or he was a bit hard, maybe putting me down a little bit, but I know he loves me, and so I need to remind myself of that. And so I just make the effort just to be nice and to say kind things when I see him. So, stand firm, be reconciled to one another. A third one is bringing our burdens to God in prayer. And I know whatever anxieties we're going through, they can be complex and things can go on for a while. It's not necessarily an easy fix, but let's be open to God, because God is a miracle-working God, and He can answer prayers. And just a small example, that Caleb is in year 5 in his school in Cardiff, and this year the size of the class was double what it had been previously. So it was a big class. And it's a new teacher, so it's your first year, and he was finding noise levels were really high, and it was affecting him, and he was crying sometimes when I picked him up from school. And so we prayed about it, he prayed about it, we prayed about it, and nothing happened initially. But we continued to talk about it and pray about it, and in the end,
I got used to it.
Caleb got used to it, and we see that as sometimes God can answer prayers in ways that we maybe hadn't thought of. He can give us the grace to be able to be okay in a situation that might have affected us before. But we see that as an answer to prayer, that God helped us in that time.
Yes, not in the way that we expected, but...
Yeah. And just the last one I want to say is ways that we can help ourselves, and if we're looking for finding peace in anxious times, is building a cell. What does that mean? Now, I'm going to refer to an amazing man of God called Wang Mingdao, who was from China, and he spent 23 years in solitary confinement. He was an incredible man of God, and he could have walked free simply by signing a form saying that he would not preach the gospel on his release. But he couldn't do that. His conscience wouldn't allow him. So he stayed, and he was finally released in 1980. And an Open Doors colleague of mine, Ron, he spoke with him before he passed away. And he said to he said to Wang Yingdao, "You have been in jail for all these years. How can your experience help me as I go back to the UK?" And Wang Yingdao replied by asking a series of questions. He said, "When you go home, how many books do you have to read this coming months? How many letters to write? How many people to see? How many sermons to preach?" And then Wang Yingdao stopped and said, "You need to build yourself a cell. When I was put in jail, I was devastated. I was an evangelist. I wanted to hold crusades all over China. I was an author. I wanted to write books. I was a preacher. I wanted to study my Bible and write sermons. But I had no Bible, no pulpit, no audience, no pen and paper. I could do nothing. Nothing except get to know God. And for 20 years, that was the greatest relationship I've ever known." So his parting advice was, "I was pushed into a cell, but you will have to push yourself into one. Simplify your life so you have time to know God." So for him, the absolute requirement is to go at a walking pace, slowing down and stilling ourselves enough to commune properly with God. So there are different ways, aren't there, I think, in which we can take some steps and to find peace in these anxious times. God who answers prayer, He's a miracle-working God, and yet there can be so many distractions around us. So just want to leave you those thoughts, and as we approach this wonderful, we'll go up to Christmas Day, a wonderful time of year. So thank you so much.